Okay. Right. Welcome everybody to this evening's session on the early years reforms. Really pleased to see lots of you. Well, not to see, but to know that there's lots of you there. And hopefully you're going to find it a really useful session. So I'm Rowena Dunborough. I'm the Support and Intervention Manager for Early Years for the local authority. And I have with me Andrea. Andrea, do you want to just say hello and introduce yourself?
Hello. Hi, I'm Andrea Keith. I'm the head teacher at Cradle Hill School in Seaford. It's nice to see you all, well, or to see your cameras and circles.
Thank you, Andrea. So we will be taking you through the session tonight. Both Andrea and I share an absolute passion for early years and for getting it right for our youngest children in school. You know, really pleased to be able to talk to you about the new reforms. So it's quite a difficult session to pitch because some of you as governors might well have lots of knowledge about early years. You might have been a head teacher, you might have been an early years teacher, or you might still be an early years teacher. So some of you might have quite a lot of knowledge, and some of you might be new to early years and you've just taken on the role of being the early years governor. So I hope that, you know, it's useful for all of you, whatever your level of knowledge. So I'm going to talk you through the main changes and the guidance documents, and then Andrea will be able to give you an idea of the implications from the school's perspective, and, you know, as a governor, how that impacts on some of the things that you might be looking at monitoring in schools. We will sort of stop towards the end for questions, but if you do have any questions prior to that, you know, do pop them in the chat, and I will try and as you know, answer them as long as I can still see my chat. I will try and answer them as I go along. There is quite a lot of information on the slides, which will all be sent out to you afterwards, along with the notes. So, you know, if I do skip over any, you've got them to look at later. Okay, I'm just going to hope that my slides now move on. Just let me know, Andrea or Claire, if they haven't moved on. So I'm looking at the agenda at the moment. So quite a lot of things I'm going to cover just very quickly. The disapplications for this summer, which you probably all know about. Then going to talk about the reception baseline, which becomes statutory from September. And then the main part is obviously the whole revised EYFS. We're going to look at how it affects the curriculum, you know, what sort of assessments you should expect, and the documentation. And then, as I've said, Andrea's going to give you her experience, because Andrea's been an early adopter school this year, so has adopted the reforms this year, so has a good experience of what it's like. And right at the end, if we have just a few minutes at the end, I've got some photos to share with you of, you know, good early years environments. So this is part of a series of training that we're doing. We've provided briefings for head teachers, for schools, you know, for teachers in schools, and for preschool settings. And this is just the start of it, really. We are going to be providing more training throughout next year. If at the end of this you feel as governors that there's something else that you would like to know about early years, please do pass that through to Claire Cornford, who can, you know, liaise, and we're more than happy to put more training on if needed. We've got early years hubs that provide training for our teachers and our preschool settings as well. So there is a lot going on to support teachers and head teachers, you know, in schools and settings. Okay, so very briefly, this year it's not mandatory to complete the EYFSP assessment. there's no need to submit data. So I'm sure your schools have probably talked to you about that. Due to COVID, just as last year, they've said that they won't collect data, and we don't have to provide our external moderation visits. They have, however, said that they recognise that the early years profile assessment is a real useful assessment to support in transition of our young children into year one and to inform year one teachers and their parents. So they are asking schools to use their best endeavours to undertake it. So probably your schools will be making those assessments to the best of their ability, depending on how long they've had their children in and so on. We've been providing support on an informal basis for moderation, as sort of requested by schools, and we've had some very useful moderation discussions. But just so that you know that there's no early years data this year. Okay, so moving on now to talk about the reception baseline assessment. This is the assessment that was due to become statutory last September, but due to coronavirus, they delayed it until this September. It's separate to the reforms. It, like I say, it should have come in last year, and the reforms would have happened this year. So it's part of an assessment that children will undertake in their first 6 weeks of being in reception. It should be conducted by the reception teacher or the teaching assistant, somebody who is, familiar with the children as much as they can be within that first 6 weeks. And it's been devised by the NFER, the National Foundation for Educational Research. The government have commissioned them to provide the materials and deliver the assessment. So the idea is to create a school level progress measure for primary schools to show that the progress that children make right from reception until the end of Key Stage 2. So it's to provide a snapshot of where children are when they arrive in school and provide that starting point to measure the progress. And they feel that this is, happening for the first time because, and we'll give credit for the important work that children do in reception, because at the moment the only assessment is what takes place at the end of the foundation stage, which is obviously when they've spent a year already in school. So the idea of this is that you can measure their progress right from the start, right from when they start school until the end of year 6, and can therefore the DfE feel they can take better account of the variation in schools in pupils' starting points. So the progress measures will be published for the first time in 2028. So there won't be any data this year from baseline. It will be sent in, the assessments will be sent into the DfE, and they will keep them and publish the results in 2028, which is when these reception children will have reached year 6. So the idea is not to provide that sort of ongoing formative information for teachers, and it's not supposed to be trying to measure what the early years settings have done. It is purely the progress measure for the end of key, from reception to the end of Key Stage 2. So head teachers should already have filled in a form. I think that was back in May that they did that, to capture key information about the schools, and then they have to nominate a member of staff who's going to be the key person for delivering, or being responsible for delivery of the baseline assessment. And the training materials also should now have arrived in school. It's all coming direct from the DfE. The local authority don't have a role in the baseline assessment. So the materials and the training should be in school now. The baseline will consist of assessment in maths and early language literacy and communication skills, looking at the early number skills, mathematical language and understanding of pattern, and then some phonetical phonological awareness and early comprehension skills. Schools will receive a narrative statement about the children's performance in the assessment. There won't be any score given. Schools don't have to share that information with parents. It's not that they're not expected that they have to send those narrative statements out. However, if parents request it, then schools will need to send it out. In terms of responsibilities, it's the head teacher's responsibility to identify any children who should be disapplied, and order the right materials and so on. Important aspect is also this confidentiality, making sure that the assessment materials are kept secure and confidential, just like with Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 assessments, and obviously making sure that all the relevant staff that are going to carry out the assessments are suitably trained, and they have to sign a head teacher declaration form, an HDF, to sort of confirm that the assessments have been carried out in accordance with the STA requirements. There will be some quality monitoring carried out, and schools will receive a phone call in September if they've been selected for a visit. Again, that's not coming from the local authority, that will be from the NFER, just to come and visit the school and observe how the assessments are being carried out to ensure that they are carried out in a fair and consistent way. So that's the details of the baseline. What I've done is I've put on the slides that you'll get all the links to any of the documents if you want to look any up. The assessment framework itself came out in February 2020, along with a validity report, and then more recently the other documents there provide all the information that the schools need. So they're all there for your reference. Okay, if there's any questions about baseline, please do type it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to our main topic of the evening, the reforms. Just pause to check nobody's got any. Okay. Right, so the early years foundation stage, as we know, has been revised. The previous revision was back in 2012. And the main aims really of the revision is to improve outcomes for children at the age of 5, particularly in language and literacy. And there is a real focus on vocabulary acquisition and developing early language and comprehension skills throughout, through all areas of learning. So that was one of the aims. And the other aim was to reduce workload, so that teachers can spend more valuable time interacting with children, rather than feeling the need to be writing everything down and recording evidence, because we all know that it's through valuable interactions and relevant interactions with teachers and staff that learning moves forward. So that's obviously a welcome change for teachers. The link there is to the statutory framework, if you haven't already seen it. So there was a consultation process, and the responses to the consultation were published, along with feedback from the government about suggestions that have been made and why they'd taken some on board and why they hadn't others. As with all things, there were some that they didn't take forward and they didn't change in response to consultation, and others that they did. So As I've mentioned, it becomes statutory in September 2021, but this year there's been over 3,000 schools in the country who were part of the early adopter, as Andrea will be talking to you about in a moment. I mean, unfortunately, due to lockdown and various restrictions, this year it's perhaps not been the best year to get a real picture of how something's going to look. But you know, it's nevertheless, I think it's been worthwhile for those who have done that. We had 31 schools in East Sussex, so you might well be a governor of a school that was an early adopter or is an early adopter school. And throughout the year, as a local authority, we've put on some networking meetings so that these 31, the staff from these 31 schools can come together and talk about how it's looking and what changes they've made. But I think the focus of the new reforms is ensuring that we get these improved outcomes and that no child is left behind. We want to diminish the gap that there is between in children's attainment. Just one quick change, one quick point really. There's a change in the safeguarding in that it now includes an explicit reference to oral health. That's the only change for safeguarding. So teachers have always needed, to talk about healthy eating and healthy lifestyle habits, but now it explicitly talks about oral health. It doesn't mean that supervised toothbrushing, although the DfE have said that they would support that if it's a local priority. We know that a lot of absence for young children is due to toothache or hospitalisation for tooth extraction. So in some areas it is a key priority. I've put the email address of Healthy Active Little Ones, HALO we call them, who are part of a team in East Sussex who provide training on all sorts of things to do with health, and they do provide some explicit training on oral health. So if any of your schools are interested in that, they can email them and ask them. There's also lots of materials from HALO on our C-Zone pages. So the educational programs. So these are the part of the reforms of the framework that form the basis for the curriculum. There are educational programs in the current framework, but they're very brief, just a few sentences. But in the newly revised EYFS, they've really made a push on providing much more detail and depth in educational programmes. So there are 7 educational programmes, one for each area of learning. And they're really wanting school, teachers to focus on these educational programmes to support that balanced approach to children learning. Lots of time still for the child-initiated learning, but also ensuring that children gain the appropriate experiences they need in order to progress. So I think this is another aspect that the DfE are really pushing in order to refocus the guidance on the curriculum and close that gap between the lowest attaining children and the average, is to really, provide more detail in the educational programmes. There's been a lot of webinars out from the DfE and Ofsted and from the authors of the new sort of guidance, and Bill Minns, who's HMI, who's a specialist in early years, has often appeared at these webinars and been really actually provided some really useful guidance. And he says that they recognise that the education inspection framework needed to change. They found that the accountability system sometimes diverted practitioners from the real substance of education. And he talks about using those educational programs, not narrowing the curriculum, teaching, not teaching to the test, which is in early years is the early learning goals that the children are expected to achieve by the end of the year. We shouldn't be teaching to those. We should be giving them that broad and balanced curriculum throughout the year. So just to give you an idea, and I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but if you haven't looked at the statutory framework and you're not sure what the educational programs are, this is just an example. As I've said, there are 7 educational programs. So in the foundation stage, we have the prime areas, which are the communication and language, physical development, and personal, social and emotional development. And then we have 4 specific areas, which are literacy, maths, understanding the world, which is where you get all your sort of geography, history, science, early, experience of those type subjects, and then expressive arts and design, so that's your singing and craft and all those aspects. So this is the educational programme. I know there's quite a lot on that slide, but like I said, they will be sent out afterwards for you to be able to read properly. This is communication and language. It doesn't tell us, what, how to teach it. It just makes sure that we should be looking at these types of things, making sure that, quality of conversations, that children learn how to have that back and forth interaction, because that's really key. And a lot of children don't have that skill when they first start school, or when they are first starting in nurseries. Really key, sort of introducing new vocabulary, reading with children so that they hear lots of language, and reading to them, reading with them, and them in turn reading to us, using those stories to role play and retell. So that's for communication and language, just gives you a bit of an idea. The literacy one, so this is the specific area. Again, talking about essential skills, what the children need to learn. Developing a lifelong love of reading. So this is where, that real focus on sharing books and reading to and with children. And the 2 different aspects of reading, the language comprehension, so being able to understand what they've heard, read to them, or what they've read, and the word reading, which is the phonic knowledge, the actual being able to decode and blend words, and also that exposure to a wide genre of texts, rhymes, poems and songs, as well as stories and non-fiction, and also the aspect of writing, which is two aspects to writing. There's the transcription, which is the spelling, so again that phonics and handwriting, and the composition, which is being able to articulate your ideas and structure them into something that you're going to say and then going to be able to write. And just finally, one other educational programme, the maths, which has initially caused a little bit of concern, as there was a change to the early learning goals. And if you know all the early learning goals, you'll know this, but they've changed them so that the shape, space, measure early learning goal, there isn't one anymore. It's mathematical patterns, and there was concern that people would stop teaching children about shape and measure and using all that comparative vocabulary. But in fact, it's in the educational programme, and that's what I've said. It's really key that teachers focus on these educational programmes to ensure that children get that breadth of knowledge. So looking at counting confidently, understanding numbers up to 10. Currently, it's numbers up to 20. So I think they've allowed for more depth and more understanding and more working through patterns with numbers to ensure a better foundation knowledge. So that gives you an example of some of those educational programs. The other aspect in the statutory framework is the early learning goals, and this is the summary of what knowledge, skills and understanding the children need to have by the end of the reception year. So really key is, as I've already just mentioned, that the early learning goals, they're not the curriculum, they are the endpoint assessment. That whole, we're not teaching to the test. They're too narrow. We need to have a much broader and wider curriculum. And just as in GCSEs, when you take your GCSE exam, it doesn't ask you absolutely everything that's on the syllabus. It selects a few things and asks, you show your knowledge in that particular area. The same for the early learning goals. It's just assessment points. So they've changed the early learning goals to make them a bit clearer and more specific, keeping that focus on language and vocabulary throughout. And another thing that they have done is removed the exceeding descriptors. So currently, children are expected to meet the early learning goal, but if they go beyond that, there are some exceeding descriptors, so you can say children have met those. And if you're familiar with looking at early years data, that would be when you see the scores, there's scores of 1, 2 and 3. 2 is expected and 3 means they've reached the exceeding. So there are no longer those scores of 3, if you like. It doesn't mean that teachers aren't going to stretch and challenge, and I think this will be, I think Andrea will talk about this role of governors of, ensuring that those, children are stretched. But it just means that you can do it in a more meaningful way for that particular child. The exceeding descriptors sometimes didn't necessarily seem to be exactly the next step in that child's learning. So I think it gives teachers more freedom for those brighter children to structure what they're providing for them. So it's been quite a popular decision to remove that exceeding descriptor. I'm not putting all the early learning goals up because that would be far too much detail. But just in general, as I've already mentioned, communication and language, that focus on vocabulary. For personal, social and emotional development, there's now an early learning goal on self-regulation, which is about children being able to learn to control their emotions, be able to wait for things, to have patience, and to monitor how they react to things. So that's been included, and the self-care is also been included in PSED. And self-care, which was previously in physical development, is all about children being able to dress themselves, look after their own hygiene, manage their own toileting needs and so on. So those aspects have been included into PSED. And that means that physical development now still has 2 early learning goals, but one to do with gross motor skills and one to do with fine motor skills. So the gross motor skills are the bigger movements, the running, the jumping, the skipping, the being able to climb and so on, and make big movements. And the fine motor skills are, the holding the pencil and threading beads and that kind of thing. In literacy, there's a change. The reading early learning goal is actually split now into 2. There's one for comprehension and one for word reading, and I've already had some conversations with some early adopter schools who said actually that really helps, because there are children who are really brilliant at breaking up words and being able to read the words, but don't necessarily then understand what they've read. So they might well get the early learning goal for being able to read it, but their comprehension skills aren't quite there. Already mentioned the changes in maths, really. They're looking at number patterns and number, and the shape space measure early learning goal has been removed. Understanding the world that always had technology as an early learning goal. And that's been removed, I think, because the technology early learning goal is very out of date and becomes so very quickly because technology moves on so quickly. And actually children are, technology is all around us. So again, it's not that it's taken out and we're not going to be using technology, it's just not a point for assessment. And they've been a bit more specific about some of the skills required in the other aspects of understanding the world. And expressive arts and design, again, that focus on language. I know that's quite a whistle-stop tour, but probably you don't need to know the precise details, but obviously it is all in the statutory framework if you want to look it up. So some of the points from the framework I've already mentioned about early learning goals not being used as the curriculum, but they are still to be used to make that best fit judgment about a child's readiness for year one, because that's what gives us the indication. Are children ready? That's the purpose of the assessment. Are they ready to move on to their next stage, their next step in education? Are they going to cope in year one? And that's what we're really asking. Making that assessment is the teacher's professional knowledge of the children, and really key throughout this framework is the fact that we're not expecting teachers to gather lots and lots of evidence in order to prove where their children are. The teachers are the professionals, they know their children, and this has been in the current framework. It's said that we don't need to keep too much evidence, but I don't think it's had quite so much focus as it does now. Obviously, there will be some evidence, and Andrea will talk to you about that, because teachers can't keep everything in their head. But I think the whole pressure of, like I say, trying to talk to a child and then write down what they've said, and actually perhaps missing a teachable moment and making it an assessment moment, that need has been removed. So, teachers can stay and make sure that they are making the most of the learning moments. The best fit model which we apply at the moment still counts. So it doesn't mean that the child has got absolutely every point within the early learning goal or every part. It's a best fit. If that statement best fits their attainment, then they can achieve the early learning goal. They won't necessarily have equal mastery of all of each early learning goal. Thankfully, the framework still recognises the importance of play, and I think as early years, as early years specialists, we know that is the way that young children learn best, through play, through structured play, through planned play, through unplanned play, but actually through practicing and being able to replay, reenact, revisit things in their play. That's how they make sense of the world and things that they have been taught. And so it still talks about play being essential, to embed and consolidate their knowledge. And scientists have discovered that it takes approximately 400 repetitions to create a new synapse in the brain, unless it's done in play, in which case it only takes 10 to 20 repetitions. So that's quite a significant difference. So yeah, play still seen as vital, and it's the way to hook young children in to learning. Still talks about teachers stimulating and working through children's interests in order to guide them and get the best out of them. But equally, whilst it's important to respond to children's interests, it's up to the teacher to also know what you need children to learn and find out about. So there is room for that child-initiated learning and adult-directed. Both are necessary to support and extend their learning. So another change in terms of moderation and assessment is that there will no longer be the statutory duty for local authorities to visit and moderate schools. This was quite a controversial decision because in the consultation, it was, very well supported. Lots of teachers really wanted the moderation process to continue. I find it useful. It's, good CPD, good, development for teachers, and gives you that consistency across local authorities and in turn across the country. But the DfE felt that they wanted to remove it in order to remove that pressure for collection of evidence. They are saying that they would encourage schools to perform cluster moderations with other schools, but that there's no requirement to do that. And I think as a local authority, we are going to continue to provide some form of moderation and including keeping the local moderation groups that teachers attend going. I think especially as it's a new curriculum, it's new early learning goals that teachers are assessing, I think it's vital that teachers have access to that if they wish to be able to benchmark and talk and network with other teachers. It's just that, there's no statutory requirement to do so. So assessment, again, it's just talking about the knowledge that teachers have and reiterating about not collecting physical evidence. Changed to the wording there. Previously, it talked about looking at their evidence in order to make their judgments. So, like I say, really recognising that teachers do know their children. And again, there's further points that appear in the framework talking about, the assessments should be about those day-to-day interactions with children, input from parents, and no sort of evidence gathering should mean that you need to spend time away from the children. And as I've said, it will be up to each teacher as to how much evidence they keep. Everybody works differently, and some people like to write lots of things down, and some people are better at retaining things in their head. But it's not a case of catching every child performing every task to ensure that you've got that evidence. Word about data. Apart from obviously this year and last year where the data wasn't collected due to the pandemic, the data will still be collected even though there's no external moderation. The schools will have a responsibility to submit their end of year assessments to us. We will then quality assure the data. It doesn't mean that we'll be coming out to visit at that stage either. It might just be that if we notice what we think might be errors, we might contact the school and just say, did you mean to submit it like that? You've got a few gaps. But yes, we will quality assure it and then send it on to the DfE. But the DfE are quite clear that the data should not be used as an accountability measure. There was a question at one of the webinars that I went to about why, if Ofsted are using the data, the profile data to see how many children are ready for year one and how much progress they're making, how that would change. And this was the response that Ofsted gave, saying that whilst they might look at the data, it's never enough. They're more interested in talking to children and seeing how it is in their settings for those children. So as we will continue to support schools in completing the profile summaries and, you know, collecting the data, as I've already mentioned, and also providing training for teachers to ensure that they know what they need to do to submit the profile. Just a word about Ofsted. As I've said, Phil Minns came and talked at some of the briefings, and he was very clear that nobody should be doing anything just for Ofsted. And I know that's very easy as an Ofsted inspector to say that, but he talked about, you know, they don't want to create unnecessary workload. They won't be looking at paperwork. They won't be looking at the data. They won't be looking at tick lists. They're really interested in how schools can describe the curriculum, how they're implementing it, and what the impact is, and how they know that. So, you know, talking about how you know where your children are. And he says sometimes Ofsted, you know, say that they see teachers waiting to see if a child is going to demonstrate something for the purpose of assessing the child, rather than actually moving in to support the child and teach them what they need to know. So really keen that doesn't happen, and that you know, teachers do support in that learning moment. That's the Ofsted definition of curriculum, quite a short definition, but it's talking about those educational programs, setting out the skeleton, and that the teachers need to put the meat on those bones to ensure that there's a, you know, a progress model, so that children can move on. And I think, and Phil Minns talks about component and composite parts. You know, the big picture is the components, and actually what composite parts do you need to give those children in order to achieve that end goal. That's just looking at, obviously, intent and impact within the curriculum. So the educational programs provide that curriculum framework that leaders build on to decide what their intent is for the children to learn and develop, and then the teachers deciding how to implement that so that the children can progress in those 7 areas of learning, and then evaluating that impact by checking, you know, and knowing what children can do. I just mentioned curriculum models and talked about the progress model, and I think there's been quite a lot of anxiety amongst teachers, because with these new reforms coming in, people keep talking about you know, progress models, and have they got to rewrite their whole curriculum, start all over again? And the answer is no, they haven't. You know, progress model is nothing new. It might just be that people haven't used that terminology before, but it's identifying that sequence of teaching. What do we start with? What do you know, where are we starting from? What are the starting points for the children? How are we going to move them on? What can we provide in order for them to progress into their next phase of learning? So being concerned about the processes rather than the end product, ensuring that our young children have enough time to embed, and as I've said, you know, practice in their play and repeat, so that they become really secure in their learning. And making sure that the curriculum is unique to your school and reflects your school and community. It needs to make sense to the children in your school. And, you know, across the local authority, there are different cultures in different pockets of you know, the areas that we live in, and so really sort of thinking about that when teachers are planning their curriculum. So, you know, I think a lot of teachers, having spoken to some, you know, when we've done their reforms training for them, you know, are looking at and reviewing their curriculum and taking it as a sort of positive opportunity to review what they have in place, but not feeling under pressure that they've got to start and create it all in a different format. And I think, you know, it's important that we've tried to reassure schools and settings that whilst we're talking about the changes of the reforms, there is a lot that is staying the same. Really important to remember and to hold on to what has not changed. You know, reassuring to know that good EYFS practice and pedagogy is the same. The whole philosophy of early years, you know, child development, they might have used some more recent research, but actually it hasn't, you know, child development, all that knowledge that teachers have hasn't changed drastically. And so, you know, despite some of the changes in terminology, we should feel reassured that lots is staying the same. In terms of assessment, the way the early learning goals are assessed, the best fit model, and the good level of development, which is the score that, you know, gets submitted, you know, how many children have attained all of the early learning goals in the prime areas and the specific areas of literacy and maths, and that's that year one readiness sort of assessment. So all those have stayed the same. The 4 principles of the early years foundation stage, the unique child, the fact that, you know, we do have to work with the interests of our children, those positive relationships that we build with our children and our families, and providing that enabling environment in order for the children to learn and develop. That's all, you know, that's all the same. So I think we should feel reassured, and I think, you know, feel quite positive about the changes. So just to take you through some of the other guidance documents, just so that you are aware of them and aware of what your schools might be choosing to use. Development Matters is not a statutory document. It is just for guidance, but a new version has been written by Dr. Julian Grenier, who's a head teacher of a nursery school in Sheringham, and has sort of consulted with a range of early years settings. I've put on the slide, there's the link to the book, which is the left hand. So the red and black is a book that Julian has written about the changes. So there's about 70 pages at the start of the book that talks about the rationale and the pedagogy, and then contains the document Development Matters as well. Whereas the one on the right hand side is the Development Matters that you would get if you went to the gov.uk website. So that's changed, and again, it depends on your knowledge whether you know what's in the Development Matters at the moment or not, but they've made sort of some significant changes. They've cut down quite a lot of the information. It's much shorter, providing more freedom for teachers to you know, decide what it is that they think they need to do with their children. They've widened the age bands. So at the moment, there are, you know, age bands, so there's 0 to 11 months, and they overlap so that you then, you know, 11 to 36, sorry, I'm probably not quoting this, 11 to 26 months, and then, you know, they overlap, so they're broken down into quite small chunks. Whereas this Development Matters just talks about birth to 3-year-olds, 3 and 4-year-olds, and then it's called children in reception. So rather than the 40 to 60 months, 30 to 50 months, it's wider age bands, because they feel that it gives, you know, that children don't develop in that sort of straight line. Children develop more like a spider's web. They don't, you know, they don't go in a straight line. And actually, if you zoom a child down the motorway in a straight line, they'll miss things either side of them, and they'll miss some of their learning. Whereas if they develop like a spider's web, where they go back and forth and revisit and, you know, embed their knowledge, their foundation is going to be much stronger. So we need to make sure that we get that practice in, and that we're not feeling we've got to quickly move them on to the next age band and think, you know, where assessment and data with all the colourful grids that you might have seen showed a progress, every term into the next age band, that won't be quite so obvious, because the age bands are wider. Julian Grenier talks about the curriculum. He reiterates what I've already said, so I'm not going to perhaps go through that slide, because I think I've talked about most of that. Planning in order to develop children's language, and making sure that they have that depth of learning. There is another document that has also been written as guidance. This has been written as an alternative, in a way, to development matters. There were several early years organisations, and on the slide I've put those early years organisations, which you may or may not be familiar with. The Tactic, National Education, Early Education, lots of early years experts who felt that the new development matters didn't provide enough guidance because they cut it down. And they got together and formed the Early Years Coalition, and they've written another document called Birth to 5 Matters. We called it Guidance by the Sector for the Sector. The link there takes you to their website. They've kept the narrower age bands because they felt that was useful. They've given a lot more detail about child development. So it's up to schools which document they use, and they don't have to choose one or other. So they might want to have both. I would certainly recommend schools looking at both documents, but they might, because actually it's not about following, because they're not, because they are just guidance. So it doesn't mean that schools have to follow one or other, but they might want to refer to both. People might find that more detail supports those with perhaps less of a knowledge on child development, but equally they might feel overwhelmed by all that. So just to say, there are those two documents out there, both for guidance. Whilst the DFE are promoting the development matters, because that's obviously the one that they've published, when they were asked whether schools could use Birth to 5 Matters, they said, as it's a non-statutory guidance, Ofsted, won't have regard for it, to which document you use. So, it is up to schools to decide. Okay, that feels like I know I did say at the start it was an information giving briefing. It feels like I've given a lot of information out. So I just wanted to reiterate those key messages, or the key changes that the DFE said, asked the local authority to ensure that we got out as messages. So evidence collection, key, that teachers are not required to collect or record unnecessary evidence, that they need to rely on their professional judgment. Excuse me. Making sure that the curriculum is planned with the educational programmes, and not the early learning goals don't become the curriculum. Ensuring that we still stretch and challenge our children to excel, and provide that that accurate information for year 1 teachers and parents, but that there's no recording of attainment beyond the expected. We've still got that best fit model, so people don't have to ensure that a child has met absolutely every aspect of the early learning goal. Assessment will still be required to inform parents and year 1 teachers, but it shouldn't. The data, shouldn't be, the data will still be collected, but it shouldn't be used as an accountability measure. And moderation, as I've said, that's no longer a statutory requirement, but we are still hoping to be able to support schools with that, and they can sign up for that as necessary. Okay, so just before I pass on to Andrea, this link at the top of this takes you to a conference, a workshop at conference where some early adopter teachers were talking about the changes that they'd made or the things that hadn't changed, and some of the comments that they made. And it really does, as I say, it does feel a really positive change, that, you know, they did acknowledge that their workload had drastically reduced, that they felt that they were trusted, that they were able to, you know, be with the children and not feel that pressure of recording, that they didn't feel under pressure to move them to the next age band, and that assessment and tracking hasn't disappeared completely. And Andrea will talk to you about this in a moment, but it's more a question, rather than trying to fit them into different age bands, of just checking, is this child on track to where I want them to be at the end of the year, or are they not yet on track? If they're not yet on track, what am I doing about that? So that it's much, you know, much simpler. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into the changes. I'm going to ask Andrea to... Are you there, Andrea?
I am. I've been listening all the way along, but I turned my camera off because, to be honest, you're recording it. So I thought, yes. No, thank you.
Yes, exactly. Well, Andrea, as I've said, head teacher of Cradle Hill, thank you so much for coming this evening. And I'm going to hand over to you. I'll move your slides on for you.
Thank you ever so much. So yeah, just a very brief introduction. So I'm the head teacher at Cradle Hill School in Seaford. We're a maintained primary school, and we have 90 children, so we're 3 form entry, and obviously we chose to be early adopters. I think early years, there's always going to be some questions about what's the right thing, what's the wrong thing, and anytime a new system comes in, a new reform, a new curriculum, there's always going to be people one way or the other saying, oh, this is great or this isn't great. When we first went in to become early adopters, we didn't go in with the mindset that we felt this was a good thing or a negative thing. We went in with the mindset that I have 3 really experienced, passionate teachers about reception. I feel passionately about reception. We felt that the changes were coming, so we just wanted to be part of that. We wanted to have a year to try it, to see how it goes. I mean, it's obviously not the year that you'd planned and intended, not with lockdowns and COVID and bubbles, but that's why we did it. So I think we came from it from an experience of a neutral, let's see how it goes. And, you know, I would say we've actually been overwhelmingly positive about it. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to reassure and let people think, actually, I think it's a good thing. And obviously, when we chose to be early adopters and reform, that wasn't my decision. I've got 3 teachers. One's a local authority moderator and was an advanced skills teacher. One's an early years lead practitioner. Another one's got an awful lot of experience in nurseries. So they're all early years experience experts and passionate about getting it right for children. So obviously, then I'm going to have a look and talk to you about what we did and our experiences of it, and obviously our next steps, because we're still learning. We haven't got it right yet. We're on a journey, aren't we? And so in terms of changes to our practice, I would say the first thing is that we have reviewed our curriculum. Now, when we say we reviewed our curriculum, that's exactly what we've done. We haven't gone, oh no, we need to get rid of it and start again. Our curriculum was already planned using our children's interests, using the experiences that we felt our children in our community needed. So we're not going to change that. That's not a significant change. But what we have done is we've reviewed it. We've looked at the new education programmes that Rowena's already shared with you and shown you some of those. And we just checked that our curriculum was right, that it was fit for purpose. Just a review of it. We wanted to make sure that our curriculum really is a progress model, that we're giving some children additional support, but all children are making progress. Every child is being developed and making progress in the curriculum that's right for our school. So we did review it, and there's definitely less time for assessment and monitoring. The effort is absolutely being placed with the children who need it. But I would say for your early years schools, absolutely it's a reviewing of the curriculum, not a significant change. In terms of the next one, reviewing time for observations, I think this has been a really key thing, and I know for my staff, they feel very much empowered about this. Observation and assessment has always been key in early years. You notice, you intervene, and you absolutely, that's our clear priority. But there is still a need to note down key observations and jot them down for memory, if nothing else. We can't possibly not be noting everything down, but there is far less of that. If you are walking around your early years, if you're going visiting your school as governors and having a look round when you're allowed and when you're able to, I think what you will see far less of is practitioners noting down and jotting what the children are doing. What you should be doing and seeing is far more high quality interactions. There will be far less of the staff writing down exactly what the children are doing and saying. They'll be talking to them instead and moving their learning forward, which surely is better for workload, and most certainly it's better for the children. So for me, that seems like a move in the right direction. And then obviously the third significant change, I would say, is the not filling in of termly data. Now, I think if you look at all those ones that I've then said are changing, so curriculum, assessment, workload, that's all in line with whole school priorities. If we didn't have COVID, it's what the rest of the school has reviewed and is continuing to review. So I think it very much is moving early years in line with that whole school priorities. Now, although though there has been a clear drive to be mindful of staff workload and think about the assessments you make, you still do track the children. There is still key points in the year that we are assessing children. So for instance, when the children came back from lockdown, my reception staff were sitting with the children reading a book, and while they were reading the books with the children, they were very quickly putting them into 2 piles. They were, literally rag rating a class list, going red, or they need support, they're not on track, amber, they need a little bit of support, green, absolutely, this child is well on track, I don't need to worry about them. So they were still doing that. Last week, when we were doing some moderation in our year group teams, they had their books out and were looking at the children's writing, and they were very quickly sorting them into those 3 piles. The ones, oh yeah, these children are doing great, they're on track, they're fine. These children we're a little bit worried about, need to support them. Those ones we're significantly concerned about. So they were still looking at that. But basically, the tracking is far more simplistic. There's not that detailed age band with emerging, developing, secure with development matters. So I think for me, it's far more simplistic and it's far more valuable. I think underneath that, I've got changes that may be perceived. So I think in terms of all the information that's come out, there are 3 changes that people have perceived is happening in early years. And these for me are perceived changes. For us, we haven't changed them. So there was some discussion about removal of characteristics of effective learning. What they're talking about is that there is no longer legally a requirement to report formally on characteristics of effective learning to parents, but they've been expanded in development matters. And for me, they remain extremely important. Characteristics of effective learning is about how your children learn. Are they curious? Are they inquisitive? They are really key skills. So for us, although there is no legal requirement to report on them, we have reported on them. My staff have just finished their reports, their end of year reports for their current reception cohort, who are our early reform ones. And the first part of their report is about the child's characteristics of effective learner, what type of learner they are. So for us as a school, we felt that that wasn't appropriate to not put that anymore. We still do it. The second one is removal of moderation. And I know Rowena's already mentioned this. And as part of the consultation, teachers were very clear. They wanted moderation to still be in place. And for me, and certainly for you as governors holding your school leaders to account, there must be moderation. If they're going to show you data and they're going to say, this is what our cohort looks like, these are the percentages that are on track or not on track, then how can you as a governor and me as a leader be sure that that data is reliable and accurate and the decisions being made about that cohort are therefore accurate unless that data has been moderated in some way? You may be, I don't know, so you may be part of a multi-academy trust that has moderation that way. You may be you may be a small village school, so you may know that you're in a federation with another school and you moderate that way. I'm a 3-form entry school, so we moderate across our year group, but that's not enough for me. We also moderate across the cluster. So I know the local authority will look at providing support for that anyway, but for me, when it says removal of moderation, as a school leader and as governors who hold leaders to account, there has to be moderation of data. Otherwise, how do you know it's reliable? And then the third thing, removal of exceeding. Well, to be really clear, all they've really done is they've taken the judgment out. So no longer at the end, my teachers are saying the child is on track or they're not on track. That's removed exceeding, yes, but that doesn't mean we're not challenging children. That doesn't mean we're not providing them with really great opportunities to stretch them as far as we possibly can. In fact, in many ways, by removing exceeding, those judgments, those can they count in 2 5s and 10s, that was really specific, what we're actually doing is breaking a ceiling, making it even easier for the children to go further, making sure they're challenged in a way that is right for them rather than just fitting an exceeding target. And I know Dr. Julian Grenier makes one of his comments, it's my favourite comment, I think it's my favourite because he makes amazing comments about children. And he says that development matters is the floor. It's been reduced not to limit expectations, but to allow teachers to be more ambitious and break the ceiling. So you think, so yeah, we're removing exceeding? Are we removing challenge? Absolutely, we're not. Okay, and on the next slide, it's things we will continue to do. Now, I won't read it to you because obviously you're more than capable of reading, although the font is quite small, and without my glasses, I might be struggling. And you'll get the slide. So I think what I'm trying to say is that actually, what is the same is far more extensive. We spoke about changing 3 things. All these things are the same because quality first teaching in early years, whether you're in early reform setting or not, is exactly the same. Curriculum and pedagogy are interwoven, and it is essential to get both right in early years, and this hasn't changed at all. When I'm carrying out my diagnostic learning walks and my lesson observations and I'm walking around, I'm still looking for highly engaged children, still looking for challenge within the environment, and I'm looking for awe and wonder. You know, that sense of positive well-being and the buzz that tells you that here, learning is exciting and engaging. You know, what does really good early years look like for children? And play remains absolutely central to learning and development. There is a need for some learning to be driven by children's interests, as well as some driven by obviously the curriculum and our expectations and preparation for year 1. But you absolutely want children's interests and fascinations to be part of that. And learning through play is really key. In fact, if anything, what I would say is these very young children, having had a lockdown and not had those experiences to play enough with other children, wow, I don't think there's ever been a time that's never been more important. So in terms of that, obviously, it's really important to us. Okay, the next one. So in terms of impact for the early reforms for senior leadership team, I think it's really important that for leadership accountability, what do we mean by that? We mean that we want our early years to be effective, ambitious, and that children are making progress. So I guess we've talked about what's different for teachers, but what's different for senior leaders? And obviously that's governors. You are part of the senior leadership team, and you are absolutely helping to hold all those leaders to account. So in the first way, what I would say is your tracking will look different. So as governors, you should expect the tracking to look different. And you may worry about that, and some may argue it's less helpful. I'm going to say I don't think it is at all. I think it's far more helpful. It's far more succinct. It's far more precise, and it's easier to do. And it's certainly easier for staff. And I think for leaders, it's easier as well. They won't be doing termly grids using development matters. So they won't be talking about, we used to talk about typical progress or accelerating progress. We're not talking about that anymore. I think actually development matters was started to be used as a curriculum, and there were teachers planning on it onto all the different age bands. And you'd be talking about things like, you know, is the child 30 to 50 secure or 40 to 60 emerging? And to be fair, 30 to 50, 40 to 60 for a start, they overlap. And emerging, developing, secure, the language has become overcomplicated. Whereas now what you will probably get is they are on track or they are not on track. And I think that's much easier. I mean, I guess the question is, obviously, if they're not on track, what's being done about that? But that's a separate question, isn't it? But the tracking will look different, but you should still get it. You'll probably only get it 3 times a year, and it probably will have very simplistic percentages. Who's on track? Who's not on track? And then maybe by your vulnerable groups. So just to be mindful that there's tracking, but it's far more simplistic. And to be fair, that ties into other year groups where it's exactly the same. The tracking is far more simplistic, and we tried really hard to make sure that that's far more streamlined assessment, isn't it, for children throughout. So although I've said that tracking is more simplistic, doesn't mean we're not doing it. And one of the key things for us for monitoring are pupil progress meetings. So I think for governors, that's the type of conversation you will be asking your senior leaders. So if the tracking's there, so what do senior leaders do with that tracking? What does the head teacher, what does the foundation stage leader do with that? Are they having pupil progress meetings? And I'm sure they absolutely are, because that's, for me, that's the key ways of monitoring. They're 3 times a year in line with the rest of the school. And they are evolving, because obviously this year's not been the best year to trial things. So they are evolving. And for us, and I'm sure it will look different in all other schools, we then RAG rate our pupil progress meetings. So we have green, amber and red, and we then have a yellow for vulnerable groups. So in those conversations, we then have children who are on track that we're not worried about at all. They're not within there. Our green children are our children who we know could be quick graspers. That's how we challenge them. And then we've got our amber children, so they're children not on track, and most importantly, what we're doing about it. And then our reds are our children who we say, actually, they're significantly not on track and they require a high level of intervention. Maybe they're the ones who might need the SENCO to come and observe, or some real additional support for them. We're worried about maybe undiagnosed barriers. So in terms of that, we've got all that information collected within our pupil progress meetings, and we can then review them. So as a senior leader, I'd look at the pupil progress meetings, I'd look at the tracking, I'd look on their learning journals, I'd check on their planning and intervention maps, all of those ways to check that our early years is being, those children are making progress. We quite often log into Tapestry. As a school leader, it's really important for you to know as governors, what does your school use? Have they got learning journals? Are they using Tapestry? How are those monitored? So just thinking about asking those type of questions. But what I would say is in terms of if you think there's no tracking and no data, clearly there has been. And as with all other year groups, how do you make sure children are making progress? You triangulate the evidence. You've got the quality of education. What's the environment looking like? What's the children's work and the engagement? Has your early years got that really great buzz of learning and excitement and engagement with those high levels of emotional well-being that tell you learning here is great? And Ofsted, in terms of Ofsted, they've been very clear in their messages. And I know the webinars support that. I've certainly listened to Phil Minns, who I know Rowena has mentioned. He's very clear. They don't want to see the assessment. What they'll be saying is, tell us about your child and what that means to your planning. So that's what they're telling the teacher. That's what they're asking the teacher. What they'll be asking you as leaders, or certainly your head teacher, is, so what do you know about the cohort and what's the impact on your curriculum? What's it like to be a child in your setting? And for us, that's what we really ask at the pupil progress meetings. And I guess for you as a lead governor, if you're a lead governor for early years, then that's the best thing to be asking your EYFS lead. You know, what is it like to be a child at your school? So reception year, it needs to be ambitious, broad and balanced. It shouldn't focus on just the early learning goals. You know, I think we've been really clear about that. That's not the curriculum, but they are an important indicator about whether the child is ready for year one. But it remains important to be ambitious for all and ensure that all children are thriving. I just want to reiterate, we are still changing things. Our pupil progress meetings, we've done them 3 times now. The 3rd time, we think we're getting there, but we'll keep changing it. And we're still working with other colleagues. You know, the local authority have got an early adopters group, so all my staff go to that. We still access all the training. There's lots of really great webinars, and I know Rowena's already directed you to 1 or 2. So I think for us as a school, we don't feel we've got it right yet. We think it's a journey. We think actually it's a journey and it's the right direction of travel, but we're still trying to learn and still training. But I would say the most important message is that in many ways, EYFS pedagogy and teaching, which is the priority, hasn't changed. And for leaders, that's really true. And I guess as governors, your priority is to be the critical friend, to ask those challenging questions. Make sure that your EYFS lead governor, when they meet with the EYFS lead, how do you know how your school is going to, or how they are implementing the changes? And yes, the assessment and tracking information may have been changed, but your EYFS lead and your head teacher should still be able to verbalise to you how children in your setting are being supported and how they are monitoring. And how do you as a governor know your EYFS is effective, ambitious and children are making progress? Well, if you're meeting with the lead and you've got your knowledge of your SEF and your SIP, which should have sections on the early years in them, and you're aware of the monitoring and the CPD, then I absolutely think you're doing exactly what you could do. And as governors, you would be expecting, and you should be expecting, your leaders to be letting you know of the changes, letting you know how your school is preparing. But please bear in mind, high quality UIFS pedagogy and teaching, it hasn't changed. It's just being refined. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Sorry, there's too many things to do. Click the next slide on, unmute, find your camera. Sorry. Thank you, Andrea. That was really useful, really reassuring. And I think, what you've done is given governors the idea, of what they should be seeing in schools. So I hope that people found that really helpful. And this is where it's really difficult, so where we can't see your faces and we don't know. But hopefully that has been helpful. I think just reiterating some of what Andrea's already said, because I think she's cued in this slide beautifully for me, that Andrea and I did discuss this. There's sort of questions that you might you might ask of your schools, of your teachers when you're monitoring, looking obviously at the SEF, like Andrea's mentioned, what the specific priorities are. Transitions are really, really key, and I think we probably haven't mentioned that so much tonight, but how are children supported moving into and out of reception, and the whole about how many children are on track, and what is being done to support those children, and just ensuring that the school is looking and using those educational programs, because I do feel that that's what Ofsted, when they're saying what does it look like and how does it feel for a child in your setting, they will be thinking about those educational programs and that breadth that you've got, that you might well have. Just coming on to the questions comment, I'm just reading, there's a few comments there. So what is Tapestry and what is Disapplied? Okay.
Tapestry's like an online learning journal. They're anyone who's got a child in reception loves it as a parent. So basically I think actually it's been very helpful during lockdown. I think that's probably made many schools move to a more online system, actually, Rowena. I don't know about you, I think it's far more common, but it's basically like having a learning journal online. It's lovely because it'll have pictures of children and their learning and activities, but it's basically an online journal.
Sorry, you froze right at the end there for me, Andrea. I don't know if that was with everybody. But yes, it's a way of gathering evidence. So some people choose to have scrapbooks with all of the evidence in, books, and others choose to do it online. And I think the beauty of the online is that you can email it to parents and they can comment back. What is Disapplied? So I'm trying to think, was that something I mentioned? Was that I mentioned for baseline, maybe, that if there's a child with significant needs, that they might not undertake the baseline assessment, in which case they would be disapplied. I don't know if you mentioned disapplied at all, Andrea.
I don't know, I was just thinking if I did. I don't think I mentioned.
Yeah. I think it's about children that perhaps can't access the baseline for very specific reasons, and that would be the head teacher decision to say this child is not undertaking the baseline assessment. Otherwise, it's expected that all children will do so in their first 6 weeks in school. Right, how many times in an academic year would you expect new UIFS governors to meet with the UIFS lead in school?
How long's a piece of string? I guess it also depends on what position and what's going on in your school, isn't it, at the time? Because I think that's a bit true about subject governors, isn't it? I would say my subject governors tend to meet twice a year, where possible, with certain subjects. But for maths and English, we meet a little bit more. I would say for early years, if you're going through a significant change, you might meet a little bit more. If things seem quite smooth, then maybe you don't. But I think mine, it's twice a year. once near the beginning and once more towards the end. So, but yeah, it's all about capacity as well, isn't it? Because I'm very mindful that some governors, I think you're amazing because you give up your time anyway and you're volunteers, which is brilliant. But and you might be in a small school, a governor with lots of different subject leads and things. So it's finding a way to do it effectively and efficiently. But at least, just knowing who they are, and it doesn't have to be a long meeting, just a 5-minute touch base with them is great. But I would say twice a year would be lovely. Do you think, Rowena, it's hard?
I was going to say, yeah, I think, like you say, it depends. Sometimes you can meet a teacher who's in a small school, perhaps the early years lead, and also, got a literacy responsibility, or, so there might be several things that can be discussed in one meeting. But yes, 2 or 3 times a year. But it doesn't have, as Andrea's just said, doesn't have to be a whole afternoon. It can be a half hour here or an hour there. So yes. Any other questions? I know we've got 9 minutes according to my calculations there left, and we will make sure we finish on time. I have just got a few photos and ideas to share about the early years environment. So unless there's any more questions appearing, and I can't see.
I would
Yes.
like to ask a question, if that's okay.
Yes.
I mean, although I really like the idea of not documenting for the sake of documenting and spending time with the children, because you said earlier that you obviously some teachers retain more in their head and know the children. How is it still documented to ensure that obviously most kids change teachers between reception and Key Stage 1 and year 1? So how is the handover then facilitated?
I think it's really important to note, Rowena, is it okay if I say?
Yes,
I think it's, we're not saying that there isn't any, there is still evidence collected. You will still have, my guess would be all schools will still have like a phonics tracker. They'll probably still have, like, we have keywords that are assessed at the end of every term. So I think there are still other evidence that is collected, and the children will still have learning journeys. They might have an English book or a maths book. So there's lots of other evidence that will still be there. But I think what you will see less of is those one-to-one long observations of children that actually took an awful lot of staff time and actually for less interaction with children. So I think probably as a governor looking into it, it wouldn't necessarily look as if there was a significant remover. I think if you were going in as a teacher or as a parent, it might look like there's less, but you still have to collect some, and there's still plenty of evidence that is there within there.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, we've got one other question popped in. How in the EYFS changes do we challenge the parents? Is
there anything in particular you want to challenge the parents with?
Yeah, I was going to say, what way are you wanting to challenge the parents, perhaps? This is my question. I'm not sure. Are you there, Paul?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, we can.
It's simply that, from my experience, a lot of the issues that we have in child development emanate from what's going on at home. How is the new EYFS going to draw those parents in so they are being more active in the development of their children? Because everything is being aimed at the educationalists to develop their children, yet the parents have an exceptionally significant part to play. And I was just wondering what your take on it was.
Sure. Yes, I mean, I would say there isn't any difference in that. I think it's always a key priority for early years to work in partnership with parents, and I think that includes both supporting them and signposting them to different places, as well as also discussing with them any concerns or challenges you might have. It's really hard, isn't it? Because I think, you've all got different settings, and I don't know, as governors, your communities may be very different. I come from the basis that I think every parent wants the best for their child, and I think the way that we get the best out of children is working in partnership with parents. So I think if there are things we are concerned about, we have to work in partnership with parents to address that. And most of the time, that can be done really positively. I don't think the early years reform has got, I don't think that hasn't altered at all how we manage in terms of supporting parents or working with parents. That's not part of that. But I think always working in partnership with parents is a challenge. But in my experience, I think all parents want the best for their children, as we do, you know, as I certainly do as a mum. So I think, you know, the aim is to always work together to try and get the best from them.
Yeah, I come from alternative education, working with teenagers.
Yeah.
And I've met some interesting parents with some very interesting children.
I think, you know, I think that's the same, you know, whatever age children you are, you know, working with. And I think it is, as Andrea says, just working in partnership and providing help and support. And I think, you know, I think one of the real advantages of you know, the early years is that you do manage to form those good relationships with parents, because, you know, they're quite open to advice often, because it's a new experience for, you know, when the children start school. But yes, the reforms doesn't provide anything particularly different in terms of that.
I think what you said, Andrea, by just simplifying it of being on track or not on track, that can actually help the relationship with their parents, because it's, I mean, to be honest with you, as a parent, if you're not from an educational background, what do I know of what 30 to 50 means, or 40 to 60? So, but if I know my child is on track, my child needs some help with certain things, that's probably more helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's quite helpful, isn't it? I feel the same when they tell you GCSE grades now, when they change those. So yeah, are they on track or not on track is hopefully much easier for parents, definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, right. So I'm conscious now we've only got a few minutes left, which is absolutely fine, because I put these photos in knowing that I might not get through them, and it's great that we've had so many questions and things, so that's really good. But I am just going to whiz through, bearing in mind you will get these slides you know, afterwards, but it was just talking about that enabling environment. What is an enabling environment? Just a reminder, you know, what we know about good early years practice is staying the same. So that rich environment, one that provides a safe place for children to learn, play and explore. You know, it should be child-centered, it shouldn't be cluttered, there should be space for children to move around, not too many chairs and tables, so that children, you know, can't have that space. You know, opportunities where children can lie on their tummies to learn or play and explore. So making sure that children are also involved in the setting up of that environment, the role play area and other, you know, other areas that they can be involved in setting them up. You won't be able to read that, but you will when you get it through. Those are the characteristics of effective learning, which Andrea mentioned, and as we say, they are still there. We just don't have to report on them. But actually, that's a really important thing to be looking at, and it's really useful if you are going on a learning walk to look at those and think, actually, what can I see? Can I see children using these characteristics? Because if they're learning something, the likelihood is they are using these characteristics. So whizzing through, like I say, resources that should be easily accessible to promote independence. So clearly labelled or clearly visible boxes so that children have that responsibility to tidy up. It doesn't mean that they can just go, well, hey, and it's a free-for-all. It's, you know, it's not, but it's about giving them that responsibility and independence. And I think the quote on there, when you cut it for me, write it for me, find it for me, open it for me, tie it for me, all I learn is that you can do it better than me. And I think that speaks volumes. I love that quote. There's also things like the book area, which are key. Looking, you know, how, and especially with this new key, you know, sort of focus on vocabulary and books, ensuring that there is provision for people to be in book corners or in dens or have story baskets where they can retell and reenact and relive and repeat those stories. Likewise for maths, not just having them in one particular area necessarily, but it being all over the place, outdoors and indoors. And again, making it, you know, accessible so that when a child's built a tower, they know where to go and find the tape measure to measure, even if they're not reading the numbers correctly. You know, that's that whole idea of it, or looking at something, you know, things to measure with. Children's own interest, we've talked, both Andrea and I have talked about going with your own interest. That's just an example. Dinosaurs are a very popular one. Just the sorts of things that, you know, dinosaurs can be brought into all sorts of different areas, you know, language, literacy, exploration, malleable materials, you know, getting messy in the dinosaur gloop and so on. It doesn't mean you have to construe absolutely everything in your classroom to do through dinosaurs, but just, you know, some ideas. I'd also be very, you know, looking for things to do with that physical development. Funky fingers, people often call it, aspects where children are encouraged to, you know, develop their fine motor skills or their gross motor skills in manipulating objects, you know, screwing nuts and bolts together and so on. Like I say, I'll leave you these to look at afterwards. And that enabling environment outside, providing materials and resources that children can't use perhaps indoors. It's the bigger outdoors, that balancing, that building of dens and you know, the water play and so on. The other key is obviously that interaction that we talked about, making sure those good interactions, and some of these things are things you might look for, because you will see, as Andrea says, hopefully that people are interacting rather than standing back and making observations. So there's just some pointers there. And I think high quality interactions, ensuring that it's not just questions all the time that are being asked. Sometimes that's the tendency. People ask too many questions of the children. And actually, when you change your questions, as it says in the quote at the bottom, Julie Fisher, from Julie Fisher's book, Interacting or Interfering, that actually if you change what you say into statements, children are more likely to talk for longer than if you're asking direct, you know, asking questions. So, as I said, a very whistle-stop tour, but I knew that that might well be the case if we had questions. So just there for your information. Finally, there's I've just put some resources, and Claire's going to send you out this PowerPoint along with a another handout which will detail some more webinars if you are interested to looking it up. But there's also the link on the slide to, you know, where it talks about some of the changes. And just finally, just a quote to finish with about, you know, recognising how important those early years are for children's development and what they lead on to in life. Okay, thank you so much for your time and for your your participation tonight. You know, we have thrown a lot of information out, and I know perhaps for some of you it might seem like, you know, too much, but hopefully it's tuned you in and given you some ideas of how things will change. Please, like I say, do get in touch with Claire Claire Cornford, if you have any other thoughts that, you know, of training about early years for governors, because Andrea and I have been more than willing to do some more sessions. I'm volunteering Andrea now. Thank you to Andrea for coming along tonight.
Welcome.
Thank you all. Did you want to say anything else, Claire, to finish off?
No, just thank you, Rowena. Thank you, Andrea. We'll send around an evaluation that you can make any comments on, along with the slides and everything else that Rowena said we're sending out. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming on a wet Monday night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.